Hi everyone. Welcome to my podcast. So the title of this podcast is Hyperbole and Historical Fact of the Bible. Yeah. So this is something that has been really interesting for me, right? Um there's been a lot of me thinking lately. And then it just boils down to the fact of the kind of person I am, right? I am someone who, when I'm reading something, I tend to go line by line, ponder about it, think through it, do my research on it, come back to it. As a matter of fact, there was a book I was reading on an algorithm book in terms of programming and stuff, a programming book. And then every time I read, there are a lot of questions, a lot of gray areas. I will research and I'll come back to it. So when others are on like page 10, I'm on page 1 or something. That's just how I am. So basically, I read the Bible and then I also ruminate on stories that I've had from my childhood in Sunday school and the likes. And that actually leads me to this topic. So where do I start from? Um, what should be the first start? Let's talk about, I think I'm just going to go with two or three passages which I feel are more of an hyperbole and not an historical fact. So essentially, let's define what an hyperbole is. An hyperbole is more of an extreme form of exaggeration. An extreme form of exaggeration. Let's say somehow I'm able to give two people at my gates 1,000 naira each, and then somebody wants to form an hyperbole on it. They could say, Mav literally fed everybody in this street. He's the richest man in this street. It doesn't make any sense, but then it's just what an hyperbole is, and it's not. You can't really say it's actually like and it's it's more figurative than an actual reality. It's not, and they still have some level of subjectivity to it. So let's go into it, right? And then we're going to start with this one, and then this about this. I think this story about Saul and the Amalekites. That's chapter 1, First Samuel chapter 15, basically. So there's this particular. I remember this is something atheists always use against Christians, right? Because someone that actually I like debates, so I sometimes watch debates on Christians versus atheists, and then they'll say things like, oh, wow! If God is all loving and all is all loving God, why did He command the Israelites to go and slaughter the Amalekites? And when you look at the scripture itself, you will notice something that is a bit striking, and to me, it was very, very, very concerning at the time I read it. Right. So the scripture literally said, "Kill every man, every woman, every child, every animal." So your pet self go collect. That's what the scripture literally said. And it was written boldly there, like it was there. So we're like, why is it? But then when you now begin to look into the historical facts, right, you get to see that, oh, around that same time, around the same time, and for context, okay, around the same time, it was a common saying. It was just something people say figuratively. So imagine if me and like, maybe like there was a country called Nigeria in like let's say 1700 BC, and then Nigeria is fighting against. I know those countries didn't exist. These countries didn't exist during that time, but Nigeria is fighting against Ghana. And then we are in the battlefield, and they are now say, "Oh, kill every man, every woman, every child, every that even that pet self, kill that." Like that's what it basically means. It wasn't really like a literal translation. And then what's the evidence that it wasn't a genocide? So it's not a genocide because even later on, after Saul's time, even David's time, he was still fighting with Amalekites. So it wasn't a genocide. He didn't wipe them all off. What I'm not very sure of, and I don't want to infer my own meaning to it, is whether they actually had the intent to actually kill everybody, including children. But then it's actually proving that that particular statement, kill every man, child, woman, animals, livestock, and all of that, was more of a figurative statement. It wasn't a literal command. So now we've established that. And then I got to know about this because of this particular man called John Lennox is old now. Basically, John Lennox is a professor. He's a professor, and then he's someone they call a Christian apologetic. And then when you say apologetic, is something that confused me at some point. I thought apologetic means someone that apologizes for being a Christian, but then I was able to figure out the real history of what the word apologetic means. It's basically someone that uses reason and facts to defend their standpoint. So it's not just a thing of, oh, I'm a Christian and this and just good. You're able to think through it and like actually defend your faith. That's what they're called. With using reason and facts. That's what it's called, unapologetic. That's actually what the meaning of that word means. So I got to learn this from him. Now, back to what an hyperbole is and what an historical fact is. I already explained what an hyperbole is. We all know what an historical fact is. Something that, oh, I could verify if I do enough digging. You could verify if you do your own digging, whether we even know each other or not. We don't need to agree on it. We just need to independently verify and figure out what the truth actually is. But there's one thing that actually strikes me, right? I'm going to, for the length of this podcast, I'm going to make it just stick to probably these two scriptures in the Bible. I don't want to make this podcast long, but when you look into Joshua chapter 10, it's mentioned, it talked about the sun actually stood still. And then to me, it raises a question: what does it mean for the sun to stand still? At the time when Joshua lived, it's believed that he lived between for 1400 BC to 1200 BC. Somewhere along that timeline was when he's believed to have lived. So if the sun was actually supposed to stand still at that particular point in time, the sun stood still. First of all, at that time, people most likely believed the sun was moving around the earth and not the earth actually moving around the sun. I think that the thing of the earth moving around, so I think that's what's called heliocentrism or something. So it is more logical for you to believe the sun actually stood still. But now that we have the understanding of modern science, we understand that actually the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. It moves through space, and then the earth is also moving with the sun, revolving around the sun. Now, and then we also know that there are other planets in this solar system, and then this solar system, we also have several solar systems in this galaxy, and then we still have billions of galaxies, which is actually very, very insane. But that's that. So at that point in time, I believe at that time, most human beings thought, oh, the Earth was the center of this universe, and every other thing was revolving around this Earth. So okay, the sun was probably imagined to be a much smaller thing as what it currently is, what it actually is now. So at that time, they probably believed the sun actually stood still. But then, if the sun, or let's say the Earth, to be more factual, stood still, the Earth is actually moving at about 1,600 kilometer per hour. Imagine you jumping down from a car moving at, let's say, 50 kilometer per hour. It's going to be catastrophic. Now imagine the OS stopping all of a sudden while it's moving at 1,600 kilometer per hour. That means every single thing will be displaced within the split of a second. The oceans will be displaced at that speed. Every human being will be displaced at 1,600 kilometer per hour. That's pretty insane. So let's believe that, okay, God actually has the power to make everything still stay in equilibrium, to stay stable and all of that, for the earth to actually stop and it to remain there for a while. Okay, because it's powerful. Okay, that's fine. But I want to believe there should have been some form of evidence that we could use to track that, to actually figure out if that thing happened. I'm sure somehow some science would have been able to figure out, okay, if there are some traces to that actually happening. Because okay, because okay, let's leave it at that. So at that time, how do we reconcile that? Don't you think it's actually more believable to accept that that's more of an hyperbole than actually an historical fact? It could be a situation whereby you could be at work. I imagine that's you just being at work a particular day, and then you are like thinking it's 4 p.m. and it's actually just 12:30, and like, oh, today is so slow. It's still the same time. The second is still not anytime slower. It's still moving exactly as it has always been. So probably they probably were fighting, and then they're like, oh, time has not gone out. Actually, Joshua prayed, and then the sun stood still, and then they finally won the war. Okay, That seems more like an hyperbole to me, and it seems more plausible that that's like actually what happened compared to the earth actually stopping. But that's just one thing. How do we verify if it's an hyperbole and if it's actually an historical fact? And then this just brings me to Francis Collins. He's an evangelical scientist. He started as an atheist, and then somehow he got so engaged with Christianity because he would see patients. Anyway, for Francis Collins, he's a scientist. They keep saying he builds this project, which I don't fully know about. I've not researched on it, the Human Genome Project, and they said it was extremely groundbreaking and all of that. So he's somebody in the science field, and he was an atheist before he became a Christian. But then he was always interacting with Christians. You see someone that is on a sick bed dying, and they still had so much faith that they would still be whole again, right? And it was always so intrigued and captivated by these people. And I was like, wow. And then he came up with this analysis saying, okay, if God is actually the creator of the universe, and then all of these principles, all of this law of nature, law of gravity, and all of that, if he is the one who actually invented all of these things, then it makes more sense for him to pause all of these things just for a greater good or just to complete the particular assignment, which is quite plausible and which actually makes sense. But then there's a little challenge I have with Francis Collins, though, not Frank Collins. There's a little challenge I have with him because Francis Collins doesn't believe it, or he also believes more of many of the things, especially in the Old Testament, you have more of hyperbole and not historical facts. Number one is Adam and Eve. He doesn't believe that there are only two human beings that started. And then the reason is because he's a biologist. If every human being came out from Adam and Eve, it would have been extremely easy to trace the DNA of every single person to two people, down to two people. He believes Adam and Eve is more of a figurative story of God just explaining how man behaved at that particular point in time. He totally believes in evolution. He believes that we came out from an ancestor of apes. And when I say ancestor of apes, it means if you look at how the evolution thing works, apes, the current apes we have today, were not like them at that time. There was an ape, there was an ape ancestor, and then we came out of that ape ancestor, and then the other apes that we see today also branched out of that same ape ancestor. So at some points we favored developing our brains, solving problems with tools and all of that, and that's what we are today. And then apes just developed other skill sets, and that's why they are not as intelligent as us today. So that's what he believes. And then he strongly believes this, even though he's a evangelical Christian. And when I say evangelical, I don't mean a Catholic Christian. When we talk about evangelical, we talk about the charismatic kind of Christian. That's who he is. Because but why does he believe in that? It's because he has seen the evidence. He's a biologist and he still believes in faith. And this is the challenge that I have, right? And that's one of the things I'm going to do. And I'm going to person here a little bit. He he tends to believe in a lot of things. He tends to accept the scientific fact, and also accept his faith. And then one thing I've noticed with him is that when his faith and then his fact kind of clash in terms of okay, what actually really happened in the Bible, and he tends to ascribe those things to hyperbole. And then it makes me question, and I'm like, okay, how many more things do we have to say is hyperbole? Hmm. But then I think the most interesting thing, I think the most significant thing is he 100% believes that Jesus Christ resurrected. And I think that's the foundation of you being a Christian, basically. So I'm going to end this here. This is just more of a food for thought. I'll be making more episodes like this going forward. Thank you for joining my podcast. Until next time, this has been Mav thinking out loud.